Welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris, and it sounds like a contradiction in terms, and in many ways, I think it is. But in recent years, we've seen the rise of a group that often calls themselves Christian atheists. They're agnostics, unbelievers, or even skeptics who, while rejecting the claims of Christianity on a historical level, actually value their Christian heritage as Westerners. In some sense, they even feed on Christianity, you might say, as a myth that reveals something deep about our common humanity. I think of writers like Jordan Peterson, who frequently speaks of Christianity as a manifestation of truths about reality, or of Douglas Murray, who actually calls himself a Christian atheist because he so values the revolution Christ brought to Western civilization. We've talked and written about a couple of these thinkers in the past here on BreakPoint, and how Christians who actually believe and trust in Jesus ought to approach these secular thinkers who are friendly towards or even attracted to our faith. Here with me today to talk about Christian atheism is someone I've known and followed online for a couple of years now. Esther O'Reilly, that's a pen name by the way, is a conservative Christian freelance writer and public intellectual who's written for Premier Christianity, Quillette, and The Federalist, and also blogs at Patheos as Young Fogey. Her work is featured in an upcoming anthology entitled Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective, and she's engaged directly with Peterson and other figures in the so-called intellectual dark web, and I'd say generally prodded them to keep investigating this Jesus person. Esther, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much, Shane. Great to be here.
So I know you and I have both enormously enjoyed Jordan Peterson's work, for instance, how he's stood up to politically correct bullies at universities and reached out to young men in particular to help them find meaning in an apparently meaningless world. In fact, I wrote a piece a while back comparing Jordan Peterson to Puddleglum in The Silver Chair when he says, in essence, that there are things too good not to be true, and then he stomps on the Green Lady's fire. And of course, it turns out that Puddleglum is right. What he believes in really is true. But Peterson is far from the only one now making these sorts of explicit allusions to Christian meaning and values without necessarily accepting the gospel as history. Douglas Murray and others are doing much the same thing. What do you think is going on here, Esther? And how did we get here from the atheism of Dawkins and Hitchens and the God delusion?
Well, I think, everyone's journey is different. I think the trajectory of Murray is especially interesting here because he was, in a sense, a sort of a product of that classic British atheism. He was a sort of mentee of Christopher Hitchens before he passed. He knew Richard Dawkins and all of these guys. But I think what we're seeing is that the cross still has a wondrous attraction. And, we in the West here still dream Christian dreams, to quote one writer. And I think that the new atheism, the more closely you look at it, the more shallow you realize it is, especially if you know something about history. So as I look at thinkers like Peterson and Murray, and also Tom Holland, who you haven't mentioned yet, but his book Dominion has been a hot topic recently, something all of these guys have in common. They've thought very deeply about history, the history of the West, as well as the history of totalitarianism and all of the things that man is capable of, including great evil. And so they look at all of this and they realize you can't just be a Sam Harris and wave all of this away in this kind of a glib fashion and just say, well, now we're all done with this. We don't need it. We can just kind of cast silly religion aside and move on into broad sunlit uplands. There's a Cambridge debate clip where Murray is engaging with Richard Dawkins and others, and he says, are you sure? Are you sure that we will really be running into the sunlit uplands? Because I'm certainly not.
Who was it who said,
sure
I think it was Christopher Hitchens, who said religion poisons everything. And the thesis of these new crop of atheists seems to be that, well, no, far from poisoning everything, Christianity has actually brought us much that's good and beautiful and unique in the West that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And I'm reading Tom Holland's book Dominion right now, which you mentioned, and he seems to me to be sort of an ambiguously either a very liberal Christian or a skeptic of some kind, because he expresses a lot of skepticism in the book about the basic claims of the Bible. But at the same time, the thesis of the book is that without this Jesus person, the West as we know it wouldn't exist, and that even those who currently disavow Christianity and who say they hate Christianity and want it out of public life are still functioning in a basically Christian mindset. They're still using Christian categories. They can't shake those dreams of Christianity.
That's exactly right. And, with Holland, I think what you saw was he sort of woke up one day and realized, oh my goodness, I like to think of myself as a humanist, but I can't be a humanist and saw off the branch that I'm sitting on. I have to acknowledge the water that I'm swimming in. And all of you fellow secular humanists out there too, sorry to break it to you, whether you like it or not,
So a few days ago, actor John Rhys Davies, who many of you know as Gimli from The Lord of the Rings, made the news at the Moviegoer Awards when he openly defended Christianity. And he said he's had to do this a few times. He said, "We seem to forget that Christian civilization has made the world a better place than it ever was. We owe Christianity the greatest debt of thanks that a generation can ever have, and to slight it," I love this, "and to dismiss it as being irrelevant is the detritus of a rather ill-read mind." This from someone who says, he counts himself a secularist and a skeptic. Esther, how do you approach someone who is at this point of belief where he recognizes Christianity as good, but doesn't actually recognize it as true?
Oh, so many thoughts when I read that. And actually, I was surprised because I'm a big fan of John, of course, as many of you are. And he's been so generous, with his time and his support for Christians in the arts, especially in lending his talent to Christian projects. I thought for sure he was a Christian, actually. I already thought he was Catholic or something. So that to see him still say, oh, I still consider myself a skeptic, I'm like, oh, darn, So many things I would love to say to John if I sat down and had a chat with him, some of which I said in my chat with Douglas Murray, which you can hear on Unbelievable. But, I think I would say the next step at this point is to, connect to the pros and the passions, so to speak, is to come to see the Christian faith not as a leap into the dark, but a step into the light, to quote John Lennox. That this is the place where the heart and the mind unite. This is the place where the heart's deepest longings and deepest intuitions about what is good and true and noble and beautiful connect with the mind's deepest understanding. So that it's not about, an abandonment of rationalism, and it can even acknowledge the place of skepticism, to test things, to try things, to look for evidence. But I think that Christianity is, in fact, the best explanation of the totality of human experience. So that would be how I would attempt to present it.
And it isn't a step into the dark, it is a step into the light. C.S. Lewis often gets, weirdly in the circles I run in, often gets criticized in the silver chair for making what many see as a sort of postmodern argument for Christianity, or maybe existentialist argument for Christianity, that, well, it doesn't really matter if there's an Aslan, or if there's a sky, or if there's a sun, or if there's a Narnia. I want these things to be true, and I want them so bad that I'm just going to believe in them even if they don't exist. And it's what Puddleglum seems to say on the surface, this character in this Narnia book. But I don't think that's the argument Lewis is making. I think his argument is actually the other way around, that because we have these longings, and this is what he says in Mere Christianity, that because we have these longings, that points us to their reality. Why would we have such longings if there weren't actually a sky and a sun and an Aslan and a Narnia or a Jesus?
Yes, I completely agree with you there. Yeah, I mean, anyone who would jump to that conclusion clearly hasn't read their other Lewis, because that would be a very un-Lewisian thing to say, that it doesn't matter because this is the true myth guy, right? But no, I absolutely agree with you. And I think, Puddleglum says, well, 4 babies playing at a game seem to be able to come up with a way better story than you're coming up with, to the Green Lady. Now, this actually connects with something that Holland has said in a podcast when he's talking about the story of Christ. He says, the more you think about it, it's pretty far-fetched to imagine, these 4 writers just sat down and made all of this up, Right. It's pretty damn compelling, it's just, there has to be something there. There has to be something to it. And so, Tom is still kind of on his journey, maybe even farther along than he'll let on in public. These things are always a dance, with the status game and everything. So he has to kind of make his own decision there. But I think it's a similar point. It's like the story is, in some sense, perhaps too good to be false, you could say,
Isn't this so fun and subversive? It's like the narrative usually goes the other way. We grew up with the narrative going the other way. It's a deconversion narrative. It's just that, you go off to college and your faith gets worn down by the atheist professor, and then gradually you just lose your belief, and one day you find yourself living like an unbeliever and not recognizing Christ anymore. But this is the opposite. It's almost like the Kylo Ren attraction to the light. It's wonderful and subversive, right? It's like a reversal.
Yeah, and Murray, at the end of our dialogue, was actually expressing some enthusiasm about this, which is, again, so funny to hear from a guy who still considers himself an atheist. But he said, I could absolutely see this scenario happening where Matthew Arnold's tide at Dover Beach comes back in and Christianity sort of gets its mojo back, because he said, I have too many friends, who are like Tom, who are kind of on this journey, who are, very well-read, intellectual people and all that, who are circling back and finding something really compelling here. And, an interesting historical point for me in all this, because I'm a huge history nerd, is that in a way, none of this is new. This is a kind of a cycle that we've seen before. There's a great book, out of print, unfortunately, but it's called Crisis of Doubt by a writer named Timothy Larson. And it takes a look at the 19th century sort of Victorian crisis of faith in England, which was famous for producing many deconverts, like you're saying here. So, with like higher criticism and Darwin and all of these kind of frontal assaults on the truth claims of Scripture, you saw this kind of great falling away. But what you don't read about so much these days, unfortunately, is this kind of forgotten history of a wave of people who came back in, of these men who were sort of like the new atheists of their day. They would go around lecturing and railing against Christianity, but then they re-examined the evidence with new eyes, and they came back and became passionate defenders and apologists for the faith. And so that's a book that I would definitely recommend to guys like Murray, Holland, Peterson, or Rhys Davies, and to say, you're not alone. This has happened before historically, and it can happen again,
It sounds a bit like one of the challenges Tim Keller issues frequently in his books and sermons, that you ought to doubt your doubts. You ought to have the intellectual integrity, not just to assume the standpoint from which you're doubting Christianity, but then to go back and question that standpoint itself, right?
Yes, like C.S. Lewis says, try doubting something else, that great quote.
So we've mentioned Douglas Murray a couple of times here already. You recently joined a conversation with him on the Unbelievable podcast to talk about his new book, The Madness of Crowds. Describe to me where he's at.
Yeah, so I would say that Douglas is maybe not quite as far along as somebody like Tom Holland in his own journey. He pointed to Holland's work very positively, very warmly, and, he has no contempt at all for people who circle back and find on re-examination that they can affirm and embrace the Christian faith. But I think for he himself personally, he says that he's still not there. And he often makes an analogy to a scene in a French novel by the writer Michel Houellebecq, where the protagonist makes a pilgrimage to a shrine of the Black Madonna and sits there trying to have a kind of a transcendent moment or experience of the spiritual that'll revivify his faith, and he feels nothing. He can't make it happen. So, I think for Douglas, he's saying it's kind of like a light switch that he's just not able to switch on at the moment, even though he has friends who are kind of poking and prodding him like, oh, come on, Douglas, why don't you just go the final furlong, just do it, just believe. And he's like, I can't just believe. I still have doubts. I still have things that are holding me back. But he's very open and curious and, I think genuinely willing to be convinced and also willing to have conversations with Christians in the public square without being so concerned for his own status. He's very open in that way, in a way that I think other people with his status perhaps aren't necessarily.
To what extent do you think Charles Taylor's idea of in a secular age plays into this, of how secularism is now the default viewpoint and the immanent frame is just sort of dominant in the public square, and so it's hard for people to deconvert back from secularism to Christianity? To what extent do you think that's playing in?
Oh, I think that's everything. I think that's absolutely the point where we are. And, it was sad to me, and I wished that I'd had more time with Douglas on this part of our dialogue, but, he described how when he had his deconversion experience in his late 20s, he said it felt like being taken around the back of the theater and being shown all the behind the scenes workings, okay, well, here's what's really going on behind religion. Here's how things actually are. And then the bubble kind of popped, and that was it for him. And so it's exactly as you're saying, that, secularism is now the default. We just have this idea that, well, of course, we just know things now. We know that you can't go back. We know the bridge has been burned. It worked for a while. It was nice while it lasted. But now there's no way to go but forward. The dream has been shattered. It's time to wake up. You can't believe in Santa Claus forever. You have to put childish things away, so to speak.
That's a lot of what I got from Tom Holland, where he just sort of takes for granted the higher critical consensus that, well, Yahweh is just sort of he's a storm god that was part of a pantheon that just gradually developed into a monotheistic god and began making all these claims. And then out of this Yahwehist religion emerges this Jesus figure who revolutionizes the world. But he just takes all that for granted, almost as if it's a confessional standard that you're not allowed to question in academia.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know quite a bit about that as well. I know quite a bit about the state of biblical studies right now, more New Testament studies than Old Testament. That's what I'm more familiar with. But absolutely, yes, there is an enormous pressure to just conform. And, of course, as everyone knows, in the sciences as well, with the Darwinian narrative, it's proof by bandwagon ultimately is what it kind of winds up being. And, there's a lot of chronological snobbery that goes around. There's a lot of credentialism. And there's a failure to even so much as open the door a crack for a minority academic voice.
So let's shift gears a little bit for a moment here. Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray both seem to frequently hit this theme of truth-telling against the mob and standing up for free speech in an academic and a popular sphere. Why do you think that is? What's tying those two men together?
Well, I think both of them are strongly aware of the history of totalitarianism. That's something that both of them are very well read in and have spent a lot of time feeding on. And for Peterson especially, it seems to have a very deeply personal angle to it because, growing up under the possible threat of nuclear holocaust, like a lot of guys of his generation, he's been sort of haunted by this problem for all of these years. And so when they see the sort of totalitarian left coming and trying to enforce these new codes, this almost kind of a new religion, there's this immediate warning bell that is kind of sounding where they're like, wait a minute, I recognize these patterns. I recognize that this is what totalitarianism looks like. And both of them have talked about the utterly sort of crushing, demoralizing feeling of being told to live by lies, as Solzhenitsyn says. And so it's this powerful instinct to say, no, live not by the lie. Always tell the truth, always.
And this relentless drive to seek the truth, it seems to me, is part of what's driving them to make these admissions about Christianity, too. I mean, when you watch some of the old atheists making ridiculous claims about how Christianity has ruined everything and how it's the source of all the evil in the world, I mean, that's their hamartiology. That's their doctrine of sin, is that, well, religion, it's all about religion. And you see them and you can just tell they're saying something they don't really believe, or at some level they know to be false, because it's their polemic shtick. It's how they sell books. But these sort of unbelievers or halfway house dwellers, if I could put it that way, like Peterson, like Murray, like Holland, seem to have a nose for truth, where they're willing to say, no, that's not true. And even if I don't necessarily accept Christianity's historical truth claims, I can still recognize that it's been enormously good for the world in all these different ways, and I don't have to be a jerk to Christians about it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that came out because Murray moderated 2 dialogues between Peterson and Sam Harris in the UK. And so that dynamic plays itself out on stage in some quite interesting ways. So, they got into a discussion of like 20th century evil and horrors, and Sam was kind of rolling out the typical, whole new atheist shtick. And so then Murray kind of countered that with a quote from another figure who hasn't come up at all here, but he's kind of the previous generation, David Berlinski, a Jewish writer I enjoy quite a bit. And Murray pulled out a quote from his book, The Devil's Delusion, where he's asking, what do the Nazis and the KGB agents and all these people, who slaughtered Jews, who put people on trains have in common? They didn't believe that God was watching them, So Murray kind of raised that as a way of saying, like you're saying, I'm not really feeling this. I'm not really buying this atheist narrative that it's religion that poisons everything. I think we've done quite a good job of poisoning things without religion throughout history,
And that's exactly the angle Peterson approaches it from, at least in 12 Rules for Life, where his argument for the existence of absolute truth and good is fascinating to me because it's the opposite of the way a lot of thinkers have historically come at it. So instead of making the moral argument from the, saying, well, there are moral ideals and then there must be a lawgiver, right, behind those, he says, well, the 20th century, it was so terrible and so monstrous and so brutal that we cannot look at this and say, well, none of this ultimately violates some kind of cosmic law code, right? There has to be good because this is so evil. That was a fascinating way of coming at it. It sounds like Murray is doing something similar.
Yeah, well, I mean, Murray doesn't have a project on like the same kind of ambitious scale that Peterson does, but I think in his thinking, he does see that as well. And I, like you, also found that to be one of the first and most fascinating things about Peterson, that kind of inversion where you start by recognizing evil, you start by recognizing what a lie is, and from there, you see if you can work your way to the good, you see if you can work your way to the truth. It's almost like Peterson's own kind of version of the cogito ergo sum is that he says pain is ergo sum. You know, you can't deny pain. And along similar lines, you can't deny evil. That's like my absolute, he says. That's like my bedrock where I start from. And once I have an absolute, even if it's a terrible absolute, maybe I can begin to build on that.
I hope you're enjoying my interview with Esther O'Reilly about the prominent unbelievers who value the heritage and beauty of Christianity. I wanted to let you know that now is the time to register for our annual Wilberforce Weekend, which takes place May 14th through 17th, just across the river from Washington, D.C. Come and join us as we honor Chinese Christian and pastor Bob Fu for his work on behalf of the persecuted church in China. You'll also meet and hear from Christian thought leaders like Os Guinness, Lee Strobel, Andy Crouch, Obianuju Ekioka, and more. Come to wilberforceweekend.org for more details and to register. That's wilberforceweekend.org. So there's a distinction that begins to emerge here among these so-called Christian atheist thinkers, and I want to hear what you have to say about it. You talked about the revolutionary appeal of Christian forgiveness during your interview with, or rather your conversation on Unbelievable with Murray. Forgiveness as seen in the case of Brant Jean, for example, or the Emmanuel AME church survivors who forgave the murderer of their loved ones. And I think that exposes this potential distinction. Some of these atheists seem to be mourning the loss of Christianity solely because it's useful. And I think Richard Dawkins, of all people, actually said something recently along these lines, to where he's sad to see the passing of the Christian West because he's not confident that it will be replaced with something better. But then there are others on the other side of things who seem to sort of see a greater appeal in Christianity. They see forgiveness and values like that as something that doesn't just hold together our society, contribute to social cohesion, but that actually points to ultimate beauty and truth, almost in a mythological sense. Do you see a distinction there between those two and those ways of coming at Christianity?
Yeah, so it seems like, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're kind of distinguishing between people who say, well, it's just kind of a shame that we're losing this because it was sort of nice and useful, and people who actually see it, that it could be a clue to something deeper and more transcendent.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there are those who seem to be, signaling that Christianity maybe points to something higher and truer beyond just pure utilitarian usefulness. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that writers like Peterson and Murray and Holland are leaving that door open, even if they may still be unsure. But none of them, I think all of them would say that they have certainly not ruled out the possibility that there is a literal truth or a true myth where forgiveness was actualized on the cross that, ties all of this together. And so with Peterson in particular, he's sort of considering all the different layers of existence or layers of being. So earlier in his career, he would get asked over and over again, well, what do you think? Do you think Jesus literally rose from the dead? Yes or no? It sticks a microphone in his face, And he kind of developed this sort of slightly vague, semi-evasive kind of an answer. But, what he said at one point, which I think actually isn't necessarily wrong, is, if you see something extremely potent and powerful at work at one layer of being, at the psychological layer, then this can be a clue that there's synchronicity and harmony with the layer of literal truth as well. So that's why he doesn't rule out the historical truth claims, even if he feels like he can't, in good conscience, affirm them. He feels like there's something there. And you mentioned forgiveness. Forgiveness is a particular fascination for Murray, as he writes about in his book. And, I think there too, maybe it's something that haunts him. It's something that he keeps sort of coming back to. And it may well have been part of what was on his mind when he took a walk around Galilee that he mentioned at the interview. And when a friend asked him, What did you feel? Did you feel anything? He said, I felt that something happened here. Something did happen here, but I don't know what,
You mentioned myth becoming fact a moment ago, and that is reminiscent of the idea that C.S. Lewis had in his essay entitled Myth Become Fact. And he actually says something, there's a line in there, or a paragraph rather, it sounds like he's describing these so-called Christian atheists explicitly, like he's watching these guys and their writing unfold, and he's describing them. He says, a man who disbelieved the Christian story as fact, but continually fed on it as myth, would perhaps be more spiritually alive than the one who assented and did not think much about it. The modernist, the extreme modernist, infidel in all but name, need not be called a fool or hypocrite because he obstinately retains, even in the midst of his intellectual atheism, the language, rites, sacraments, and story of the Christians. The poor man may be clinging, with a wisdom he himself by no means understands, to that which is his very life.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, of course, you wrote your wonderful article comparing Peterson to Puddleglum. I've also written comparing Peterson to the character of Emmet in The Last Battle, who's the young Kilorman who says, well, all my life I've been looking for Tash, but really what he's looking for is the good. And so then when he meets Aslan, that's when he recognizes Aslan as the actualization of the good and falls on his face and worships him. And so, I felt with Peterson in particular early on, I felt if he did encounter Jesus, I would like to think and hope that he would recognize that this is actually what he was longing for all along. This actually is the culmination. This actually is the fulfillment of those desires.
Yeah, that's what I say every time I listen to one of his talks. By the lion's mane, I almost love this young Kilorman.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly.
Do you think, Esther, there's an evangelistic pathway from atheists who recognize that Christianity is either useful or transcendently beautiful to getting them to recognize it as true?
Potentially, but I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer there. And, for Murray, of course, there are all kinds of factors that, we didn't touch on for obvious reasons, but everyone has to find their own personal path forward. And so I think the best way is just a lot of sustained conversation. I will say this, I do wish that there were a way for Christian case-making to sort of get out of its own bubble, so to speak, and find a bit more of an audience among these intelligent non-believers. I've begun a correspondence on something called LetterWiki, which is a great website for having long-form, leisurely conversations back and forth about whatever topic you choose. I've begun one of those correspondences with another young writer named Ben Sixsmith, who's a guy who hasn't come up here, but I would put him in this same camp of the younger generation who's very thoughtful and writes intelligently about Christianity, is open to Christianity, sees the shallowness of the new atheism. And so I'm going to open a dialogue with him about why I'm a Christian and, and why I think that he should come over and believe it as well. And so I think the path forward there is, like I was saying earlier with John Rhys Davies, is to find a way to present Christianity as the harmony, the bringing together of different things, so that we don't have to exist in this kind of a split house mentality with the two stories, as Francis Schaeffer talked about it, where it's like, well, here's the part of me that has all of these kind of drives and instincts and whatnot that I can't quite ground or place in anything solid. And then here's the part of me that's trying to be rational, that's trying to think things through in a logical way that just can't make the mental move of giving assent to it. And so the path forward is to bring those two things together in a fresh and compelling way.
And I love what you said about there not being a one-size-fits-all path from unbelief into belief, because historically, when we look at the great converts of the faith, there are all kinds of different pathways into it, not in the sense of, syncretism, but in the sense that their journeys to accepting that Jesus is Lord have looked very different. Some of them have been miraculous, like St. Paul. Some of them have been more of a confluence of different moral influences and longings, like with Augustine. Some of them have been more like C.S. Lewis, where he's sort of intellectually convinced over the course of a period. But there's also an element in his conversion story in Surprised by Joy of finding that Christianity is the fulfillment of all his deepest longings. It's the northernness that he's been looking for all his life, right? And he is, in a sense, Imeth there. And I love that because that's truly how it is. There's not a one-size-fits-all formula. There's not a silver bullet. We can't just approach these thinkers with some kind of apologetic rubric and think, well, this is going to do the trick. And we don't know whether, I don't know what perspective you're approaching the divine sovereignty issue from, but I'm a staunch Calvinist, and I think that, nothing is going to happen ultimately unless God opens their eyes or gives them ears to hear. And there's a mystery to that because we don't know when that happens. I can't even tell you when that happened for me or how because I can't remember.
Well, I'm afraid to say I'm not a Calvinist. I do come at this from an Arminian perspective. I do think that faith does involve an act of the will on the person's part. But I do also agree with you that, of course, the Spirit needs to work and lead as it will. And I think that, for somebody like me, who occasionally I can be typecast as a heavily intellectual, cerebral type of person who does think that if you just give them 5 fast facts in a book, then that'll do it. It's the rubric or the recipe, as you're saying. But I've never believed that. I don't believe that at all. I think every journey is different. And I think that there's an enormous power in just the example of the church churching, as it were, when it's doing so the way it should. And one of the most powerful images I've taken as I look at these guys' writing and work is for something that Murray wrote about encountering the persecuted church in northern Nigeria, which is a crisis very few people are really writing about, and he's one of the few who's kind of brought it to light. He talks about sitting in one of their services on a Sunday and just watching them pray and sing hymns and give thanks and worship God, even in the middle of this horrifying massacre and persecution. And it's, a sort of iconic image. Here's the man who can't believe kind of sitting, watching all of this and feeling this deep, deep longing for a country he's never seen, that he can't cross over into, but he sees this and it's beautiful and he wants it. And I think that kind of an example can also call to the human heart in a powerful way that in a sense transcends argument or debate. Not that those things are bad, but I think that all of these things can converge and come together.
Well, Esther, let's step inside the church for just a moment here. If there are those on the outside who are atheists by conviction but are attracted to Christianity as a myth or as a moral system, are there those inside the church who fall into the opposite trap where they accept Christianity as factually true but fail to understand its full implications for life and culture and morality and beauty and all these things that the Christian atheists, so-called, are recognizing?
Well, I mean, yes, the sense that I've encountered people in the church who I'm fairly sure are actually not saved, who, I wouldn't trust as far as I could throw them. I would trust some of these other guys I've interacted with long before I would trust some of these people. And so I guess that may be a little bit more personal than what you were kind of getting at there with a sort of a cultural point. But yeah, I think absolutely that is true. And I've seen Christians who I think, they'll forfeit their integrity in various ways. And, they'll affirm the truth claims, but as Peterson says, they're not acting as if,
Mm-hmm. It's that practical atheism issue. Where instead of a Christian atheist, you're a practical atheist. You're someone who lives as if the truth claims that you profess aren't true, instead of the opposite, which is that you live as if the truth claims you deny are true.
Yeah, and you're not willing to allow it to kind of actually refine you in the way that it needs to.
So if there's someone in the life of one of our listeners who fits this description, who either admires a lot of these thinkers and writers or who is in the same place spiritually and intellectually as they are, a sort of Christian atheist, what advice would you give a Christian friend or loved one who's trying to engage this person and trying to bring them in the direction of faith?
So I would say I've had those conversations quite a bit, and that's one of the great joys for me that's come out of the whole Peterson phenomenon kind of following in its wake, is all the conversations that I've been able to strike up with people in exactly that position who are fans of his but weren't quite sure of the next step. So I think I would say listen a lot. I would say make time for conversation at their own pace. Don't assume that you know what they're going to need, before they actually articulate it, because you might think that one thing is the sticking point for them, but then it actually turns out to be something completely different. Mm-hmm. And so if you speak too soon, you might miss an opportunity to learn something. So I would say spend as much time listening as possible at first before you move to say, well, here's a resource I might recommend, or here's an argument, I wonder if you've considered, that kind of a thing. You know, I'm not a huge fan of the whole debate format. I think that, unfortunately, apologetics as a marketing tool has tended to build itself on the back of debate with, you know, opening statement and response and bite-sized back and forth. And I think that the beauty of conversation is you have time. You can take time. You don't have to package things into quick, bite-sized quantities. So that's another thing that I would say is resist the urge to compress everything. Allow things to unfold organically. Allow things to take their time. And don't be discouraged if you have a conversation and at the end you feel like it didn't really go anywhere. You know, there's always another time. So be encouraged and just keep investing in that friend, because they will appreciate the fact that you're investing in them, whether or not they're convinced particularly quickly. It's the investment of friendship that will stick with them and carry that forward.
I've been talking with Esther O'Reilly. You can check out her work at Young Fogey at Patheos. Is there another place they should go, Esther, to check out your other work?
Well, I'm afraid my Patheos spot has been languishing a bit, although you can find some reflections on my talk with Murray there, which I called my friend the gay humanist, a bit provocatively. But so most active on Twitter, so my handle is Esther of Riley, and that's basically the best kind of one-stop place to follow me when I produce new work at different outlets and things. I'll tweet it out. I do tweet semi-frequently, so be sure to check me out there.
Well, Esther, thank you so much for joining me here on the BreakPoint Podcast.
Thank you very much, Shane. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Remember, come to wilberforceweekend.org to register for our annual Wilberforce Weekend Conference in May. It'll be a great weekend with incredible speakers. That's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.